One day, the game of Ether was released as a game for women, but, by the arts of destiny, it had more male players. This game had several easy characters, as well as difficult ones. Among them was one in particular, who was a useless character with horrible characteristics. Someone has been playing for more than 10 years. The protagonist, who is named UCO Player in a Sunset. The protagonist checks the messages and notices that there are many comments about the game. After reading some, he is surprised, since there is a final boss in a dating game. He thought that the game would end if he ended up with the main character, but he observes a comment that indicates that this boss is invincible. He understands and questions why there is a final boss so powerful. He wonders if he is a book on the part of the game. They say that in the world of Ether, there was an organization called Dark Demonic Humans who helped the other world. These were gatekeepers who wanted to take over this world. One day, they finally achieved their goal. At that moment, the Dark Dragon appeared. The protagonist thinks about it and mentions that he only cared about the clashes, so he didn't research in the history of the game. Thinking, he comments that he'd better try it. He then turns on the console, and after accepting the confrontation, he mentions that he will show his skills from these years. Into the game, we see him prepared. In this, he tells us that his character is the only one who can't use magic, and therefore the other players never got together with him, mentioning that he is basically the worst extra in the game. But on the contrary, of all, he can use some magic in that the dragon charges its attack. After finishing, the protagonist prepares to throw it. He observes carefully and with a plan in mind. We see that this one goes after him. He tells us that he can use the blink spell blink after putting on his gear. We see from behind that he is preparing to load his attack. He tells us that his blink spell allows him to travel 3 to 10 times faster, so if he doesn't choose well, the place could die due to speed and the thoughtful impact. He remembers his skills, but mentions that that is not what will stop him, as his character has mastered the blink ability well. In that, we see his characteristics and his attack traits. He is thinking about things and remembers that the spell was just a skill of movement, but he became obsessed with it, so he improved it enough. He comments that during these years, he has played as the character who doesn't use magic in battles, so we see that he attacks the dragon, and after passing through it with his attack, he observes that he eliminated it, and the system congratulates him for defeating the final boss. Already in the present, this one is happy, indicating that he killed it. We see that he is ready to see his rewards. Also, he mentions that he will publish his achievements with the community in hopes of sending the message, but suddenly a system message appears. This surprises him. He tells them that the Ether world came to a wrong end, so 90% was destroyed. But he was the one who came closest to reaching the true ending, and therefore asks him to reach the true end. We see that this surprises the protagonist, who does not understand what is happening so suddenly. We see that he already appears in another world. He opens his eyes and is surprised. He cannot believe it. He holds his head and asks what happened, observing the surroundings and not understanding where he is. Then he realizes something, and when observing a mirror, he approaches and sees. He is surprised as he notices that he has the appearance of his game character. Suddenly, a system message appears, which surprises the protagonist. It tells him that Episode 1 is escaping from persecution. The protagonist understands and remembers that this is a prologue of his character Yusuo, and he recalls something. Searching in his pockets for a note, he has something when observing, mentions that it is the certificate of entry to the Stella Academy. Confused, he can't believe it, he is definitely in the world of Ether. And he's still the character of Bakuseo, mentions that he should be positive since that voice told him that he had to get to the true ending, remembers that this game didn't have a real ending. Suddenly, he remembers something and wonders if anyone has managed to reach its true end. He curses for it and comments that he should not think about it too much, since according to his memories, his character, when he wakes up, the people who were chasing him locate his location. We see that on the outskirts, there are many hooded people who go. Looking for Yusuo, the protagonist quickly hides and curses, because they will find him. At that point, one of the hooded men observes the surroundings and notices that there is a hut ahead. Ask the colleagues who are going to investigate. Eta Gas Apilis. Protagonist, thinking, mentions that he can avoid them, but he won't be able to finish them off. He wonders what he should do, but soon the system appears, which tells him he can use the ability Blink. This surprises the protagonist, since notices that he can use his ability Blink. observes the blink skill, and remembers that it was his only skill, that he practiced all his life back in the fox. Back to the present, we see him confused since the system tells him that he can use his blinking ability, observes its features, and can't believe that now he is controlling his game character. Suddenly, he remembers he had to escape, and frustrated, mentions that he no longer has time, observing them for a while, and comments that has no choice but to escape. In the outskirts, we see the hooded ones, who observe that you are escaping. Asks to stop, they tell us that this is part of the tutorial. So you need to escape from those hooded men using his Blink's ability. To think about it, they carry magical equipment, so his only way to escape is by using his skill. So he tries to concentrate now, has no confidence in being able to use it, but remembers that he already used it several times. In the game, the hooded men ask to stop, but after observing them, he notices that they are already catching up to him. So he tells us that the main disadvantage of his ability is if it fails, it could crash and die on the spot. In that, the hooded man, raising his gun, asks him to die. But the protagonist, after feeling it, decides to use his skill and achieves to evade him at high speed. In that, we see him confused but excited. He indicates that he achieved it. This surprises the others, who wonder if he is a magician. But their boss asks not to distract, since he knows the consequences of that ability. So they must catch him, but he is surprised to see that that skill had no effect on him. The protagonist continues running and watching the field, mentions that he has to use the terrain in his favor, he is analyzing, and tells us that 99% of players were not able to pass the tutorial. But the 1% who made it didn't either master it perfectly. So his blink skill is invincible. Then he manages to escape, and the hooded men do not. Can you believe he used that skill that way? Quickly, he asks to the wizards to attack from a distance, others make presents, and the protagonist observes them. Notices that they will attack him with magic, remembers that the second part of the tutorial was to use his ability to blink, to dodge magic attacks. He mentions that before he could see everything, thanks to the monitor, but now he won't be able to dodge it. Suddenly, the system appears, which tells him that he is using the ability syndrome. The protagonist notices something, and we see that he can feel the attack's distance, quickly. Begins to dodge them, but one of them is directed at him. This, with a step forward, activates his blink ability, with which manages to avoid the last attack after the collision. He observes the chaos and notices that was a powerful attack quickly. Manhwa, sir. He stands up and then continues escaping. In that, he arrives at a place, and at Observe mentions that his last test is to cross the canyon using his ability. He looks at the place and comments that his only the way to pass is by calculating the distance. Mentions that after that will arrive where there are some wizards to finish the tutorial. Tells us that to pass this test he has to calculate his blink ability, but if fails once, maybe he will die in the attempt. Noises that there is many floating rocks, and with some calculations mentions that he will be able to do it. He clenches his fists, cursing the bastard who made the tutorial. He thinks again and mentions that the problem now is the bastards, because they are chasing him. He curses, since they are closer than he thought. Suddenly, these begin to attack, and the protagonist thinking mentions that he only has one left method to survive, which is kill them all. So in the place, we see that the protagonist positions himself for his attack. Observing comments that it is crazy because he has never been in a fight before. He mentions that if it were the game, he would do it, but this is the reality. So the hooded men arrive at the place, and the protagonist, taking a pawn, mentions that they are already here. This is how he prepares and wonders if he can win. We see that when you leave his hideout, he is observed, and the hooded man asks the group to catch him. Everyone quickly sets out to capture him, but they notice that he is not doing anything. Excited movement. Excited he mentions that it is a useless since he plans to fight with everyone. We see the protagonist calm, and in a moment for another activates his ability of blink. Suddenly, the hooded man feels something, and the surprised leader notices that his companion was pierced. This quickly throws out a large amount of blood, and the protagonist, putting more pressure, mentions that he feels his blood running through him by his hands. But he doesn't feel any feeling of guilt, so he withdraws his weapon, indicating that he will kill them to survive, takes a position, and then send it to fly. Maraso Tolzaras. This is directed where the companions who cannot believe that he has killed him. but they notice that he eyes escaping. The protagonist, escaping at full speed, tries to escape. Thinking indicates that he already eliminated one, so he has to look for distance. After turning, observes that nobody is chasing him and wonders if they unfollowed him. But suddenly he notices them and mentions that apparently it was not the case. Surprised, he says that they will attack him with magic. He tries to escape. But the leader of the hooded men asks them to kill him. We see that the magicians begin to conjure and then throw them, and the protagonist doesn't know what to do. Watches the attacks, and cursing, he mentions that he will not be able to avoid them. Suddenly, he looks at a place, and stretching his hand, we see that activates its ability to blink. We see the place in tatters, and the hooded, as he approaches, he begins to laugh. Because at last they got rid of the protagonist, and wonders where his body is. But then the protagonist approaches him at full speed, and the other, turning around, can only observe it. Tells us that, peculiarly, the ability of blink maintains the same momentum after its use. So we see that he stabs him, and after the loud cry, the companions ask themselves what happened. So from one moment to the next, the protagonist surpasses him, which leaves confused them. We see the corpse falls, and the protagonist, after relieving himself, mentions that there are only 2 left, comments that he must eliminate them before they could catch him. But the hooded man's surprised. Can't believe that reaction, asks who the hell that kid is. The protagonist observes him and tells us that his features are not as high as of the majority, so he will not be able to continue dodging at such a short distance, so decides to attack, indicating that he must end this. But the other man, laughing at him, says he already knows his fighting style, mentions that he only uses blink, and that stupid dagger. So if he protects Akaru from Manhwa, the vital points will not be able to do anything to him. So he decides to launch his attack with a strong scream. K-pop activates his ability. The protagonist, after getting close, also activates his ability. The other, in his way, launches his attack, excitedly mentions that he wants to see how writhes in pain. But suddenly, he is surprised as he observes that his comrade was killed. This one curses because that previously did not want to face them. The protagonist says yes, indicating that thanks to them, he "s" improving a lot. This annoys the hooded man, who, gritting his teeth, tells her that he is a brat. Tells him that this time he will kill him, but suddenly, the protagonist attacks with great speed. He raises his weapon to then throw it towards the subject. Hiei perceives his attack, and analyzing it tells him that will not let him attack again. In that, he mentions that he will now attack him for the side, so he just has to move his weapon. But is surprised to see that it was not the case. He turned around and noticed that the next attack will be from the front. Like this, we see that they liquidate him, and he mentions that his attack was always from the front. In that, the system mentions that the first testing has been completed. In that case, surrendered and all badly wounded. He observes his bloody hand, looks away to observe the corpse that has the side. In that, he begins to remember and comments that this event was truly real. Looking down indicates that he killed someone for survive. In that, Engagements begins to get up and taking a breath. Chalsama indicates that he should get out of this place. But that's it, notices something, and looking at the corpse. He mentions that he doesn't want to do it, but he has no choice. In that, starts checking it out, and taking out a large amount of money. He mentions that with this, he will be able to survive again. Observes the path, the bin of bone, and indicates that the problem now is to cross that cliff. The Pransak stands on the shore, and seeing the surface, wonders what he should do. But suddenly, someone asks if he listens to him. The protagonist observes the other side, and notices that it is the group of magicians of the tutorial. Quickly starts yelling, and the magicians ask if he will be able to cross over that. The protagonist tells them yes. One of them informs their colleagues that they will wait, as it will soon cross, but the colleague asks if he can do it now. That cliff could not be passed by anyone. But suddenly, when observed, they are surprised, since the protagonist is using his Blink's ability, with which he goes passing the cliff. When observing it, they ask if he is a magician. But one of the magicians indicates that he is using the Blink ability. We see that this person was a woman. The partner understands, and he wonders if he can control it. Wonders how it is possible for him to control it. But he notices something, and on the other side, you see 2 people. One of the magicians wonder if they are with you. but notices that those guys are carrying a skill they launched it trying to finish you. The protagonist notices this, and cursing, uses his ability. To avoid this, he turns his gaze and notices that there are two more hooded men, asks if they were with those mercenaries from before, and cursing indicates that he has to wait for the cooling of your skill. Quickly begins to search his new point, but realizes that the evildoers will attack him again. We see that he barely manages to dodge the attack, and when observing, he notes that the stone is breaking apart. And that's when it begins to fall, and cursing, he comments that he must find another floating stone. In that, he locates one, and start activating his skill, with which hardly manages to hold on to it, and looks down, and says that he will survive. But suddenly he is attacked, and cursing. He can't believe he's going to die, but soon an attack appears which counters the enemy attack. After the collision, we see that the place is cleared, and the protagonist, observing it, wonders if it was that magic. Since in his opinion they were two attributes combined, surprised, questions who was able to do that. We see that the cause was the girl belonging to the magicians. In that, the evildoers can't believe it, and terrified, they begin to escape from the place. The protagonist observes them, and relieving himself indicates that he will finally be at peace. Moments later, we see him reunited with the magicians and observing the girl. Start thanking him for what he did a while, but she asks not to take it importance. The protagonist understands, and thinking mentions that her voice is very pretty, but looking away indicates that these evildoers will be known last bandits from nearby villages. Mentions that such misdeeds are led by the dark demon cult. Then he looks to the other side and comments that now they will no longer be able to pursue him. He is relieved by it, but suddenly the system appears, which tells him that YHIS next test is to enroll in the Estella Academy. The protagonist understands, and he mentions that it won't be very difficult for him, but looking at the name, he notices that part of it is more dazzling, which leaves him surprised. Already at dusk, we see that they are removing the protagonist from the place. Resting begins to dream, in that we see memories where he promises his mother. He promised that he would be a magician, holds the book of magic, and says that he will study a lot. To make her happy, we see that they spent hours studying, until one day, his mother heard the worst news for her son. See that this affected the child, who couldn't believe it, so we see him crying. The protagonist wonders if they are the memories of Yuson. Now in the present, he wakes up and holding his head. He is surprised to see that it is already dawn. That's why a colleague asks if it's already woke up, because very soon they will arrive at the satellite city of Arcanium. Moments after that, they decide to take a break. And after everyone got off the carriage, the protagonist begins to stretch, but notices that the girl watches him and tries to tell him something. But the girl quickly moves away. Look, the protagonist is happy, because after she doesn't hate him, but thinking about it and rejoice. Everything is the same as before modern times he lived. Tells us that in this world, there is magic, so cities have installed trains and flying ships. That are cars to make long trips. He mentions that now they are heading to the city. To get on one of those flying boats, he says that this city is on the route towards Arcanium, so the real start will start in said city. Nema says that in Arcanium there are magic towers, knights, and 5 renowned academies. Mentions that the academy the Stella Academy, is outstanding. The geniuses and nobles of the whole world are enrolled in it. Sinmini. In that, it is a question of how Byoso entered the academy. Comments that he will see his features, and after opening the panel, we see his data. The protagonist understands some things, and mentions that if it were not for this reason, he would have already died. He tells us that he has a cursed physique, so he can't accumulate mana, but thanks to Paydeck can detect the mana around him. With his sixth sense, he also perceives the attacks directed towards him, without looking at them, so if there was a threat, he could detect it. Mentions that it is a skill useful for Yusio, but can't use it a lot, since it consumes a lot of mental power in its use. Observes its physical conditions, indicating that it is not bad at all. Thus, he tells us that in this world, not only is it not the level that matters, but the statistics of stars mentions that the maximum level is 9 stars. But he never got there because his biggest record was 8 stars. Comments that for now will invest its points in sensitivity to enhance his 6th sense. as well increases his level and comments that now you have to improve mana syndrome now. Otherwise, he will not survive for long. He says that the way to improve his syndrome is going to the academy. So he has no choice but to enter and put an end to this dispirited world. Disappointed, he mentions that he doesn't want to go, but he doesn't have another option. In that, the system tells him he has some notifications. But the companions indicate that they will leave. The protagonist understands and mentions that he will review it later, but we see that the girl had been watching him. Already in the flying ship, we see several nobles, which also go to Arcanium. But one of them looks at the protagonist, indicating that he is a villager. He calls him and arrogantly tries to humiliate him. The protagonist observes him and, understanding the situation, sighs. Halapates, as this is a scene of those noble idiots. In that he is retreating, but the other is furious, asks if he is making fun of him. Squeezing the entities indicates that he will kill him. Saproweta Chabala Sada, he tries to stop him but notices that the others are making quite a bit of noise. He asks what's going on, but is surprised when seeing a girl who is the Princess Villian. The protagonist turns around, remembering that name, tells us that this is the princess of the Adolabid Kingdom. She is entering the scene. The man from before tries to greet her, but the princess looks at him coldly and ignores him, which surprises him. Looking at her, not knowing what to say, so he decides to keep silence. In that, the protagonist observes her and tells us that she is the villain of this world. Tells that she and the protagonist are the main ones in this story. So in the end, Villian dies. Mentions at the end that there are several routes. In one, she is coldly murdered. In another, she is harassed. Until at one point, she is expelled from the academy, very humiliated. So she decides not to appear again in history. Also mentions that he heard that the princess is very popular with men. Famous dies, so he won't mess with them. He suddenly feels very hungry. Chamacha, yacha chamacha, indicates that he will go get something to eat. After arriving at the kitchen, he is surprised because everything in the place is too expensive. Leaving the place, he mentions that he will eat something else when he gets to Arcanium. But then the speaker starts making noise, which announces to all presents that will arrive at Arcanium in 10 minutes. Asks them to go to the first plant before landing. The protagonist nervously mentions that he will finally start his new life in this world. Moments then, we see him discouraged and sighing. He wonders if he will be able to survive at the Estella Academy. Looking at the outskirts, mentions that he would like to have help in these situations. In that, remembers and mention that he will see the notifications he didn't review. Looks at the system, in which there are 3 special rewards. Thoughtfully wonders which he should choose, cute and after accepting the system, tells him that the data doesn't match, so the ability will be lowered by a lot. This surprises the protagonist, since they lowered his skill category. This is how it goes explaining things, and the protagonist concludes that he can't get powerful items since he is a rookie in the game. Then he looks at the last object, and asks if he can use Bobo glasses. The system analyzes it, indicating that it is compatible. The protagonist understands and decides to get that item. After holding it, he says that those glasses are a type of storage of information in the game. Fassi, since in the world of Ether there is no, you can save the acquired knowledge. So the players created the glasses to store such information. He mentions that he also tried it for Diechor, which is now very convenient for him. We see the characteristics of the glasses, and the protagonist, with a word, opens the tab from storage, which shows him all the tabs that it entails. Reviews some articles and comments that he is already ready. So we see him thoughtful, but soon he sees someone. Everyone starts to talk about Dutch's traitorous daughter, wondering why she came to this place. The protagonist remembers her name and activating his glasses. He mentions that we'll check her information. In that, observes her status panel and note that it is the false heroine. In that, he tells us that AZ was a prominent character in a game called Etherworld. This story is based on a fantasy novel romantic called Don't Love the Princess. It was about the heroine Izzy, who had lost her entire family. Comments that after that event she grew up confronting the villain Zhang Weiyang. In the end, ends up with the male protagonist of the story. He tells us that his plan for revenge disappeared, and the characters, males, protected her, so her history had several critics. comments that although the game is based on the novel, the story is completely different. Since they added a character to the game, character called Flam, who assumed the role of heroine, this had its own story, where she was a reader of the novel, but one day she was teleported to the world of heroine. After understanding all this, mentions that he does not care about that, but when observing her, he mentions that he thinks he saw her somewhere. So it is decided not to think about it, since he has to prepare to leave this place. Now, at the Estelle Academy, we see everyone, the trained students. And the pontiff starts with his speech, ends indicating that magicians must protect the world from darkness. He also mentions that they will start the ceremony with the oath of the best freshmen. So asks the most outstanding students to go up to the podium. We see all the students, and the protagonist, when observing them, mentions that everyone is the main protagonist. But the one that stands out the most is first-year representative Mayu Seon, who entered with the highest score, mentions that he finally meets the famous Mayu Seon. Tells us that this is the most adjusted character in the game, who has a lot of potential and is a genius natural in this world. Observing him, he mentions that even if he can't get to the end of the story, must try the drawing Mayu Seon to the good side. But that will depend on how Flam thinks and acts. Wonders if he should get along with her, since she has an advantage in information he should take the risk. Mentions that Flam has the same characteristics that he has, but in the story he's just an NPC too. Also says that she has the special ability to clean. And apart from that, it also has the ability to impoverish those around her. Observing Thiet, he mentions that he better not come closer to her, since he could be affected by that ability. He says that he will support them from afar and not get involved. As time goes by, thus they announce that this concludes the ceremonial entry. The system also congratulates him on completing his second test. Moments later, we see the protagonist in his classroom, and can't believe that he became a student again. But still, it is very comforting for him, since he has that clock. Hali Tessa tells us that this clock is the Kiairina, which represents the student as member of the Academy Estella. Mentions that with this, he will receive better treatment than most of the warriors. Excited, indicates that he wants to leave to use it, in that they open the door. And an instructor asks them to settle down since they will begin the entrance exam. The protagonist becomes frustrated as he cannot believe that on the first day he has to present an exam, notes that this exam is called the class organization exam, meaning it will organize the students according to their capacity. So the teacher starts the exam. The protagonist takes his exam and observes, indicating that he does not understand any question. They tell us that this exam is known for its crazy difficulty. Hello. And to this, students are assigned due to the results. But those main characters obviously will be in Class S. On the other hand, the protagonist mentions that it is enough for him to just enter .so. He doesn't care about the class. Suddenly realizes something. And watching Mayu Seon, notices that he is very calm, and notices that he already finished his exam, understands why he acted like this. He says that his character was boring since he was born into a powerful family, and had a great talent. For that, everything was easy for him. But that attitude changed according to the protagonist, since he can get the evil or good attitude. He says that the dark humans would be very interested in Mei, as it is a prodigy. But now his biggest problem is his family. Seeing his exam indicates that wants to compare himself to him, but suddenly he remembers his glasses and wonders if he can use them. M takes them out for check but is stopped by the teacher. Hicha Hara Ha, who asks me to give him those glasses. Then he takes it and begins to analyze them. Sorohoroho. The protagonist begins to pray as he could be discovered and be expelled the first day. Suddenly hears something, and the system asks if the protagonist wants to activate it. Surprised, he asks me not to do anything, indicating that it should stay still. Teacher finishes examining him and handing him the glasses. He tells him that next time you should ask first before using it. The protagonist is relieved, and moments later, this one has used them. Observes the answers and excited indicates that he can get the first place. Starts writing and thinking comments that he could even get to Class S, but the teacher asks them to hand in their exams since time is up. The protagonist remains surprised, and suddenly the teacher takes away the exam, so all exams are directed towards the teacher. After seeing the exams, Jasad and are surprised by one of them. Jasad and Jasad The protagonist begins to remove the glasses and mentions that apparently he will be in Class F. But suddenly he hears a scream. The teacher shouted and asked him to give him those glasses. Fatam Asaklam. Fatam. Which leaves the protagonist confused again, begins to examine it. And after not finding anything, asks a student that goes for Dr. Grahan. Jasso. 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 Russell wonders what is happening since is acting differently. Wonders if he got caught cheating. Moments later in a basement, the teacher of magical engineering begins to examine the lenses. After completing a sulfus indicates that there is nothing suspicious about them. So according to him, he did not cheat. He mentions that definitely solved the exam with his own ability. Thus approaches him and congratulates him, asks Professor Lian to apologize to the student he understands, and apologizes for the misunderstanding. The protagonist does not know what to say. In thinking, he comments that he will have to be cautious, so as not to get caught. Moments later, in the office of the Professor Liang Wu, we see him reviewing the entrance exams, observe the first question, Chaya, and can't believe that they have responded to that, someone calls him, and asks if they are the first-year exams year. This is an academy advisor. Professor Edel Taemin, who excitedly mentions that apparently there is good students. The other tells her yes, indicating that there are members of large families. Like Hyon, there is also Maze Calvin, and finally, the successor of the Magic Tower. Hei Won Riang. Treplame the teacher. Second Meike is happy and tells him that she thinks it is a good thing that the exam is higher than the teacher. Lanul thanks for it. But remembering, in the question, he mentions that those questions were very difficult to respond. Tells us that his intention in those questions was to see their flexibility mental, and how they could solve it without any help from a text. Since in these days, memorization is not equivalent. Since in this era the combat is the fastest trial, mentions that those questions were not in their plans to be resolved. But within all students, 10% of them responded. That most of them did not get the question right, but 3 of them managed to answer. The first one was Mayu Seon, who is the prodigy of the century. The other is Flam, who was recommended by the director. And finally, there was UCO. Thinking mentions that he did not expect that solved the first 3 questions. The companion observes him and asks why the protagonist, since he solved the 3 first questions. And not the rest indicates that there were more easy questions, but he solved the most difficult. She asks if he thinks that student is a genius, to which the other mentions that he doesn't know, so she decides to retire. And the professor, after sighing, looks at his letter of entry, where he has a letter which indicates that the student can control the blink skill well. The teacher begins to understand, and excited indicates that he is a magician specialized in blink, mentions that he will check it very soon. Moments later, we see the students who are going to be assigned a class. Askism. In this, the protagonist becomes discouraged since in the game he could see the list with just one click, but now you have to go personally. That's where the list appears from the exam. One of the students recognizes the protagonist and wonders why what is in this academy. Maina, since he was in the worst magic classification. So he decides to walk, and after arriving at the list, comments that will look for his name and get out of this place as soon as it starts. Searching for his name, and after not finding it, a big scare comes to him. Because according to him, he was expelled for not answering the whole exam. But suddenly, he hears talk about him name, who indicate that it should be a mistake. Observes the students, and surprised, he wonders what is happening. This way, he decides to approach Tusi, and when observing, he is surprised. Wadubisam, he observes his name, and wonder why it is in this place. Tries to analyze it, since he was admitted to Class S. In that says that Class S is the most special of La Stella Academy, and that only 41 students are allowed in it, holding on to his head. Try not to believe it, since he will meet the protagonist more often. Thinking indicates that he did not want to get involved with them, but can't do anything now. He mentions that he will apparently have to stop being perceived. He decides to withdraw, and suddenly the protagonist appears. Moments later, in a place of the academy, we see a woman beating the pretty princess. She is reproaching her, and we are introduced to the fire element teacher, Honyel, who is the mother of Bian. Asks her why she did not answer the first questions, and how she couldn't beat them all. Mentions that she should be the best one out there. She says that she will do it. The mother watches her and calls her by her name. She asks me to listen to her. She says that she should not be like her, who is expelled from the kingdom. And Chorprazamachanzal is now a simple teacher, indicates that you should not be a disgrace to the kingdom. So she approaches her, and taking her by the face, orders her to be better than her sister. With a Machiavellian smile, asks if she understands what she wants to tell her. She answers yes, but sad indicates she does not understand. Tells us that she lives the way she was taught, and that's why she doesn't understand why she torments her so much. Moments later in Class S, we see all the students ready, and the protagonist can't believe he's in this kind of class. So he is listening to the comments from colleagues who cannot believe that the protagonist is in Class S. The protagonist understands that apparently he is not liked by his peers, so he decides not to pay attention to them, indicating that this is due to the exam. He thinks about that and wonders if there will be students who move up a class, a habitessa. He comments that he will check it later. And watching the co-stars of the history, can't believe it's in the same class as them. He comments in some years, most of the students will be famous, and some of them will also bring you to the magical world. Observing Mayan indicates that he is one of them, but looking at Flam, he comments that she could avoid it. Suddenly, enters the teacher, who asks us for silence. The protagonist is surprised, and the professor indicates that he will present himself. Presents how the Class S teacher, Lian Wool, some students remember that name and they mention that it is very powerful. As he is a magical warrior of 7th grade, the teacher asks for silence, indicating that they have many talents, as there are also some unique ones. Says things from the academy and indicates that hopes they become good magical warriors. Mentions that he does not wait that they all do it, but would like them to give their best. Asks if they have some doubts, but after observing notices that there is not one, so ends his presentation. But we see that the Stud Young arrives at the place. This one introduces to the teacher, and the protagonist, watching her, can't believe she's arriving late on the first day, and that he observes, and notices that something happened, decides use his glasses to check her data, observes her characteristics and notes that has guaranteed death. Pia surprises and wonders what that is guaranteed death. Remembers that in the story, she is killed by Flam, so her destiny as a villain is inevitable. Taking off the glasses indicates that he would like to save her, but reflecting indicates that he cannot do. That's because he has to keep distance. This is how he thinks about things, but soon, Bi Yinon stands in front of him and looks at him carefully, and the protagonist does not understand what happens. Now as that villain decides to take a seat, which worries the protagonist. Surprised, he wonders what is happening, since the things they wanted are not there coming out well. Then the teacher indicates that before starting, they will first make their pentagram succession, informs that the Class S and Class A will do it together. The protagonist understands and thinking mentions that it will be a little annoying, but it will be waiting for it. He explains that at the academy. There will be 2 major events. First is the contract ceremony family, and the other is the ceremony of succession of family, and the other is the ceremony of succession of staff. So we see them gathered, and the teacher asks to get ready because they are going to start. He tells them details and ends by indicating that they should take a stick from place. Asks that be careful as each stick is of different level. In that, the protagonist remembers and tells us that in the world of ether, Gatanidiapintachalix were the ones who chose their carriers, so he can't choose a staff just because he wants it. Then he loses a cane and wonders with one he should choose. Thoughtful indicates that he must choose well, Nanti. Since it is in the S class, he says that the best thing for him is the wand, since the staffs are usually 2-handed classes, and the rod in 1 mentions that said wands are wielded by knights who cast fast magic, and on the other hand, the sticks focus on a blow to long term, in that he listens conversations which are asked which stick the protagonist will choose. He decides not to take them seriously, because he doesn't care what others may think about him. But then someone calls him Olatibe, and the protagonist observe it. Asks who he is. The other student introduces himself as UCIE. The protagonist understands, but the other asks what stick the protagonist will choose, and tells him that he will choose anything. But the other, despising, he asks him to choose a stick from his level, Khreitita, indicating that he should not cause problems. The protagonist does not understand what means, and withdrawing, asks that he also do not cause problems. This bothers the him, who angrily calls him a bastard. Manam asks if he is looking for a fight, to which the protagonist takes on his glasses and begins to view partner data. After that, being disappointed since that guy is an extra of this world, in that the other, he points to a cane, indicating that he will teach a lesson. The protagonist observes this, Bx observes this, and after remembers that the cane, et muri temeri, is the most powerful of the upper middle class, and that these are used by professional magic warriors, mentions that in this test he has a stick limit of lower middle class. Thinking of you as a cane is impossible handling for magic warriors. It also indicates that there is another staff of upper middle class in this place. And that is quite unnoticed, in that the class teacher asks them to choose the cane that they like. We see that the nobles find their sticks, and also the Princess Villian. Suddenly, a great force appears, which surprises everyone. Report that nobles like the princess also chose cane's middle class. So they go around showing off, and we see that these comments go affecting Usli, who quickly prepares to pick up the ethery staff. All they recognize him, and wonder if he plans to choose that upper middle class cane. We see that Usla, all excited, asks to observe carefully. Adulchach, as he is a true talent, so he takes the weapon ethery. But soon a great force comes out of him. The protagonist understands what happened, indicating that could not be linked to it. Thus we see Usle, who is badly hurt. This surprises everyone. Who is asking help. The protagonist notices that someone is coming, and on the stage, this is getting closer to the weapon ethery with a smile. Observes the weapon, and we are told that the owner of this weapon was already decided from the beginning. Everyone recognizes him, and they wonder if he plans to choose that weapon. They mention that he will not be able to control it either, but we see that he is ready to take it, and behind the great force of power, we see that he smiles as he sees that he has achieved master it. All students surprised. They can't believe that type has been able to master a staff of upper middle class. So everyone goes flattering him, and the protagonist observing him mentions that now Mayu Sion will be more known in the world. We see that he manages to observe it, which surprises the protagonist, who observes that Mayu Sion is not going smiling. This surprises the protagonist, who wonders what's going on, in that he tells us that Flam will also get a staff of upper middle class called Teraban. But also mentioned that maybe this is the route where the history changes. Mentions that if he gets the weapon Tehran Musion, he will be interested in her, and the history will take the Mayusion route. But if he chooses another staff, the story will be completely different. Thinking indicates that you should use it to bring Mayu Seon on his side. He sees Flam, who the proto is looking for a cane. The protagonist observes the weapon Thiban, and nervously wonders if he will choose it, and tells us that if she chooses Thiban, the male protagonist will be interested in her, and will have the possibility of reaching to an end. But notices that Flan passes by Thiban, surprised, wonder what's going on, Puri Samplan, since she doesn't seem to be interested in that. He analyzes it and tells us that this is very bad. Mentions that she can resonate with any staff as she is the protagonist. Says that if she chooses a strange staff, the story will never come to its end. Kara Stochalaja, so he will have to guide her on this path, activating his ability. He mentions that he has no choice but to help her choose Thiban, so he uses his blink ability with which he puts behind her. Flam notices it, and, turning around, she asks when he approached her, Anyer Tark, Achulos Charaya Kisbetark, Hansbi Karkar. In this, the protagonist greets her and asks which staff she will choose. She says that is none of his business. The protagonist mentions that he just wanted to help her, but she orders him to not get in her way. Says goodbye, but the protagonist tries to stop her, but notices that there is something strange, remembers that she was always friendly and very sociable, but now she is very cold. He says that he will not give up because his life depends on this, so he asks her to wait, indicating that he wants to help her choose. The girl asks him to move away, but we see that the protagonist is insisting. She, little by little, gets a little bit annoyed, and after reaching her limit, questions, what does he know about canes? The protagonist does not know how to respond, and he says he just wanted to help her. Then he points to the Tribon weapon, indicating that she would be able to take it. Then he is saying positive things, but suddenly feels something strange. feels a great sensation, and suddenly wonders what that is. Suddenly he feels much stronger, and after finishing, we see that the great pressure is holding something. He looks at the weapon and is surprised to notice what is the weapon Terabon. Daman Alfazier wonders why he is holding that, since according to history, this is the weapon of Flams. Then turns his gaze and asks if the girl is okay. With a smile forced, she asks what does he mean. The protagonist tell her that it's nothing. But thinking, he mentions that he screwed up moments after completing the test. We see the girl protagonist, who is listening to the companions, who are talking about the students who achieved acquire upper middle class weapons. She can't believe it, because the story isn't like that. Moments later, in a place of the academy, we see the protagonist, who is relieved since she spent the day listening to this news from those two students, but she tells us that she can't understand it. Mofieso, because when she saw he could dominate Fiben. She mentions that she read the novel and did not remember that a character has appeared, a character named Yusiol. Also comments that she also did not hear that T-Bone could be dominated by another, and that now that person is showing off to her, already in the present. Mentions that she won't think about it anymore, but suddenly someone calls her. They ask if she is going to study. Turning around, we see that it changes rapidly of attitude. One of the girls mentioned that she studies too much, and she says that it is correct. One of them asks why she calls them little girls if they are the same age. Flam tells them that it is just a habit, since where she lived was the oldest, but thinking indicates that she is now in the novel, and that it is difficult for him to act as a girl. Another question is if she will study alone, to what is observing her recognizes as Jackie, but wonders why does she look so much like her. She tells them that he will only do a few things, and that's why he's in a hurry, and says goodbye to them. Moments later, by the halls, mentions that it is difficult for her to act. We see that it is walking all thoughtful, but suddenly feels a great hit. After grabbing the head, we see that the culprit calls her by her name. She recognizes him as J1 Ran. He asks her if she is okay, and she answers yes. But the other one, noticing something, asks why she seems depressed. She says she isn't, but thinking about it, asks if he is worried about her. Then they talk about some stuff, and after some time, they will separate. They stare, but Jay is smiling. He raises his hand and tells her that then he will say goodbye. Thus he moves away from the place, and the girl, without understanding, comments she will also leave, but them notices something, and notices that the companion Jakey has been watching her. She decides to greet her, but we see that the other one escapes. This confuses the protagonist, who wonders what happens, then decides not to take importance by indicating that she has things to do. Tessas, it's the Chajulares Esidalacha Kaspara. Moments later, arrives to a study room and tells us that, according to the novel, in this place are the main ones of the novel. Thus decides to enter, and inside we see that they are the main protagonists. Already in the interior, decides to go to her place. Already inside, notices that the host of this meeting is Kayleigh, who is from the Class A. She says that he seems surprised, but that it's from Bachengarach. Why is it next to the famous ones of Class S? But observing in another direction, observes the protagonist and the partner, tells us that Mayu Seon would be considered the protagonist of this world, but is interested in that guy Yuseo. Mentions that it is strange since that guy solved alone the 3 questions of the exam. So in conclusion, he knew that if he could solve those questions, he could enter the Class S. So, all nervously mentions that he should have known all that in advance. Concludes that Yuseo is dangerous, and that the protagonist sighs, as we see that it is being harassed. Machu question of why he came to this place, because in his opinion he does not need these things. The protagonist can only laugh, indicating that he doesn't know the reason, but seeing it, he wonders why it is so interested in him. Then someone asks silence, indicating that it will begin with the exam problems. Mentions that they should already know about the 3 questions, so he will explain to you how he solved them. But he curses, since everyone in the place is influenced in the school. Suddenly, he notices someone and mentions that it will be his big chance. So with his macabre plan, mentions that he will teach him who is better. So decides to start with his explanation, and after writing the problems, is saying the methods that used in those questions. Everyone goes jotting down their notes, But Mayuseon, he looks at the protagonist and asks if it is right for him. The protagonist doesn't understand. We see that he only observes the protagonist. He wonders what he means. He says that for him, the questions were nothing. So he goes thinking that answer him Ishans comes to the conclusion that he will be honest. So he tells him that for him that is not correct. This surprises all those who cannot believe that the result is wrong. The protagonist notices the looks of everyone and wonders what happens. We see what Kale destroys the chalk and asks the protagonist if he is doing it wrong. Mention that then he can solve it because he wants to see if he can do it right. This shocks the protagonist, who can't believe what happens. In that remembers something, and observing the partner notices that the other, he did it on purpose. Without saying anything else, decides to go solve it, since he got into it in big trouble. Already on the stage, he observes the questions and puts the glasses, indicate that he will solve it. He says that these questions are like a wordplay, makes its little example, and all confident mentions that he will teach by holding on to his head. Question: who was the creator of that question? In that, the classmate mentions that he solved it as if outside it was a mathematical problem. But seeing the question, mentions that his answer was not wrong, so he tells him that its development is wrong, indicating that he cannot tell him how he solved it, but yes, he failed. He tells him a few things, suggestions and questions, and asks if his method will still work. The other, surprised, doesn't know what to say, but the protagonist tells him that his method never will work on them. Mentions that he got the answer right by pure luck and that the teachers did not want to let him know that. The other person tries to excuse himself, but concludes that the protagonist is right, understands his mistake. And so we see that, explain the details of the question, all the students are writing down the explanation, but we see that the female protagonist is surprised because she does not believe that everyone paying attention to him. Observes the novel protagonists and remembers that they had to fight over the problem. In that wonders if anything changed. Moments later, we see Mayuseon saying goodbye of the protagonist, indicating that they will see each other tomorrow. The protagonist also says goodbye, but now alone mentions that he does not want to get involved with him. He looks at his hand, and he mentions that he doesn't want to see him anymore for the rest of his life. So he decides to retire, and wonders why he is so interested in him. Lega says love. Remembers that nobody, apart from the protagonist, is close to him. He suddenly notices Princess Beyond, and wonders if she is waiting for someone. So he decides not to give it any importance, since that is none of his business. But he is surprised, since he observes that she is calling him. She tells him that she wants to ask him something, so the protagonist asks what she wants to know. Beyond questions why he didn't explain the solution, this surprises the protagonist, and doesn't know how to explain something that he doesn't even know. So he thinks about something, and tells her that he doesn't know how to say it. She is surprised, and after analyzing it, mentions that she understands, comments that surely he doesn't want to show his solution in this place. The protagonist thoughtfully mentions that it is not that, but Villian quickly makes a proposal, tells him that he will compensate him for what he knows, asks for everything to be explained to him in detail. Amzicius prizes the protagonist, because he doesn't know what to say. Moments later, in the library, we see them prepared, and with the entrance exam, the protagonist proceeds to check it, and ask if she really wants him to help him, since he only answered 3 questions from the entire exam. Villian says yes, indicating that she wants to know the solution to those questions, so she will do anything for him. The protagonist observes her, and doesn't know what to say to her, but questions why he wants him to help her if there are more students in this place. She understands, and mentions that of all the students, only 3 managed to solve those questions. This surprises the protagonist, and the Princess Villian tells him that those questions were impossible. But he and 2 others students managed to solve. The protagonist begins to tremble, and surprised, asks if they were trick questions, what Villian answers yes. And devastated already, understand why you are in Class S, he also already knows why Flam stopped him. He tells us that he did not know about these details, nor the questions of the exam. But Flam did, since she read the novel, mentions that although he does not know the history of the game, must know the scenarios of history. Like those 3 trick questions, but with his intervention, she must have known the existence of his character, curses, and already knows the reason why she acted that way. He questions Villian, If she would do anything for those questions, she says yes, the protagonist mentions. Then he wants her to transform his cane into a magic sword. Villion says she can do it, but mentions that those weapons are only for mercenaries of low level. Questions, why do you want a weapon of that magnitude? To which the protagonist mentions that this fits better with his combat style. Questions, if she will be able to do it since he has things to do. Villion thinks about it and tells him that she will do it. The protagonist understands, and observing mentions that he will help her. Tells her that that question is a change of perspective. Villion doesn't understand, but the protagonist remembers that Villion's weakness was concentration, and that was why she was stuck in her routine. She mentions that after her defeat, she realized of his defect, but that was already too much late. Keisei. On. He thinks about it, and asks himself, how could I help her to correct her defect? After thinking about it, asks if she knows what a meaningless contest this is. This confuses the girl, who tells him that she has heard something about that. The protagonist understands and tells her that he will make her an example. Questions. What is between a knee and a good knee? Villion thinks about it, and she tells her that it is the back part. The protagonist tells her no, indicating that the answer was and. Asks her to remember the question, since he told her what that there is between one knee and one good knee is about analyze it. But after failing to do so, she observes the protagonist annoyed. He asks her to calm down, indicating that she should look at the questions, since to solve it she just has to use creativity. This surprises Villion, who tries to understand. The protagonist asked if she believes being able to memorize creativity. To what she tells him no, the protagonist does not understand, and she tells him that it is impossible to understand, since for a magician. The most important is to look at the limits of the thoughts. Mentions that magic can grow with some small changes, as long as the mind is open, explains some things, indicating that she is better at analytical thinking than him, but lacks the quality of creativity. We see that this is slowly getting annoyed, that a point comes that the protagonist is afraid of her. The protagonist notices this and mentions that very soon she will reproach it, so he decides to finish, and asks if she understood what he said. Villion says yes. This reassures the protagonist. Bahadiha? Since he doesn't even know what he was saying. Moments later, then he mentions that they will now make some problems, asks her a question to what she is thinking and tries to answer. Hamami tells him that she doesn't know the answer. The protagonist understands and tells her it was time to sleep, so we see that they ask him several questions. Aka. Where Veon doesn't know what to say again, another question. But note that Velen is already at her point, notices that at any moment will silence everything. Surprised, decides to continue, and asks if she knows that the cloud said to the ocean, billion. Listen, this, and the protagonist again does the question. She is thinking, and the protagonist, observing her, he asks her to understand it. The girl gives her answer, which surprises the protagonist, who tells him that it is correct. This makes Villion happy, because finally, the protagonist could understand it. He observes her, and he tells us that he had never seen her smile like that. Decides to flatter her, saying that she learns very quickly. Villion takes composure and asks for the next one. The protagonist understands and mentions that they will continue. After several hours, we see that it had already fallen night, in that we see the protagonist, who goes walking all downcast. Takes a little air, since he never thought it would take this long. He remembers everything he said to her, and cannot believe that she believed all that. But suddenly he remembers something, and we are told that Villion is undoubtedly an excellent magician. But due to her weakness of thinking, fell drastically. Thinking mentions that even if she is the villain, he does not like that sad ending. That's how he thinks in things. And comments that better for now, he will go to buy the books that he needs. Moments later, this one arrives at a store. Look at the place and notice that it is quite deteriorated. But seeing the staff tells us that this bookstore is something strange. Remembers that a student, he took a book from this place. Niedian graduated from the academy with a high score. He mentions that previously, he only had to press the button to learn the knowledge, but now needs to specialize in a few things, so he thinks and looks for the book. He comments that if he gets the grades from that girl, will be guaranteed the highest grade. Suddenly he sees something. Clan Drulin, Zealine notices the book among the crowd. Habubus, Clan Drulin, Zealine Cyclus, Segabo, so he decides to take it. But suddenly, someone breaks in this. Zeline, Galinsakalis. He turns his gaze and notices that it was AC, Vera. This question, if you know who it is, what is said, is yes, since she is very famous. The other also recognizes him, indicating that his name was Yuzoi. This surprises the protagonist, since he remembers that the other had not been introduced to anyone. She thanks him for the debate the other day, but it was a pity that there was not finished explaining it. So she decides to withdraw, indicating that she liked meeting him. The protagonist observes her and relieved that she didn't take it, but wonders why she is in this place. We see that the girl takes a book, and looking at the price, he decides to take it. The protagonist notices this and wonders what is happening. He tells us that this bookstore specifies to sell used books for what poor students usually come to these places, but does not understand why someone like her is in this place. Remembers that her father was killed by the Dark Humans. He mentions that he already understands the Mogai, why he came to this place, and tells us that in the Isai also had a bad ending since she died before Flam became the protagonist. Comments that she was the only one who had the worst ending, in that he takes out the books he chose and asks the person in charge to calculate them. So he tries to show off, but the girl, observing all that, tries to say something bad, but mentions that the topics that chose the protagonist are very interesting. Takare Petulanizie, thinking he understands what she wanted to tell him. In that we see the books, and the girl question of why you chose that topic for his advance, since in these times magic and alchemy are more accessible. The protagonist says yes, but he mentions that this is why he is studying them. This surprises the girl, who asks what the protagonist means when he tells her that. All the students think like her, so he chose that class to get better grades. So he says goodbye, and we see that with all this, he will be able to get good grades compared to others. Confident comments that this semester will pass without problems. The day next, we see Izzy, who is looking for her class, thinking about where she can get the best notes. But upon arriving at the place, he notices that it is full of students who do not believe that the rumor of this course has spread throughout the academy. They are talking, and the girl Izzy understands that he will have to make an effort if she wants to be the best in this course. After completing the subject, we see that everyone is retreating to the cafeteria. Izzy sighs and can't believe that there are so many people in this class. Sighs because it won't be easy for her to get a scholarship. Soon her stomach growls, and she takes out some notes, says that she will eat first, notices that she has few tickets, so that to survive the semester she will have to eat bread, but suddenly notices something, and observing it carefully, mentions that it is Yuseo, wonders what he is doing in this place. Seeing the class mentions that there is few students, so maybe it is cancelled due to lack of students. And that is what she wonders, if he would join maybe could improve her grades, Shira, and take advantage of the time to improve her other classes, and earn money for her scholarship, stares at you, indicating that you too had to choose the material to pass easily. Shocked, she comments that he already planned his stay in an easy life, so decide not to believe, and turning around he mentions that it must just be a coincidence. Moments later, we see the protagonist attending .at, the teacher's explanation magic, who is Professor Lading, tells us that the founding magician expanded the magic around the world, mentions that he taught the elves the magic of nature class, and the dwarves magic of the matter, finally indicates that humans taught elemental magic, Hatene Kaching. He goes on giving his speech until a point. The protagonist tells us that he will not be able to hold on, as this is very tortuous for the one who is already a graduate. But thinking about it, he mentions that this could give him some clue of the true ending, so he decides to pay attention to it, but notices that something is not right. He turns his gaze and wonders if she was always in his class. Tells us that it does not remember that a main character will take this class, Anyitaro, if he decides not to take it seriously. Indicating that the teacher must attend, tells us that humans are greedy, Iplan, since they started stealing the magic of other species. But after the course, they could not learn them. Favale tells that the founding magician had left the 12 divine moons, for later disappear, asks if they know what they are, those divine moons. Isoeza mentions that they are guardians who protect the balance of the continent, as well as that they disappeared thousands of years ago. The teacher tells him that it is so, indicating that the divine moon symbolizes summer, tells that the sixth moon of the red summer brandished a red flame. In those flames, they never became extinct. Yaharer. Yaharofad Zeminang hating they titachad them indicating that if they enter the Almanac, they still be able to see those red flames. This is how it goes, explaining the details. And showing the image, mentions that this is the coast of Levian, mentions that it was a large whirlpool in the middle of the ocean, but it was frozen by the blue winter moon. Comments that these moons have individual powers, so if they do come together would make a miracle, a student asks. What a miracle, what the teacher tells him that he doesn't know, the protagonist. It tells him that he has reason, indicating that he knew some of those moons. He tells us that he knew 5 of them through limited events, and that, thanks to the information of other players, was able to complete them. If he is right, those moons have something to do with the true ending. That's what he thinks, and concludes that he has no choice but to find out about those divine moons. To see the true ending, moments later in the training camp. The instructor tells them that strength is not enough, that's all. Because if they don't manage to hit the aim, the attack will be useless. Pilesa. This is how she is qualifying to her students, but suddenly observes a peculiar attack which calmly hits its target. She watches this, but suddenly gets surprised, since notes that the objective was not damaged by the attack. Decides to search for the student, and after locating him, as she mentions, which is unfortunate, since note that it is her daughter, Princess Billion, Zoe. Then we see her all depressed. Since she showed her mother a pitiful show, Worried mentions that she must be of being disappointed in her. But then someone calls her, asking her if she is okay, decides to take a seat, and praising her, Billion asks what he means by that. The classmate tells her that she used the same magic as her, the Kaskana. Many times Vion doesn't understand by indicating that although there is used, did not aim at its target. The other one, he says it doesn't matter, Maya Sekonfaya. Since her magic was great, Dirkya Man tells her to be honest. Always heard about her since was a little girl. Vion understands, and remembering mentions that her name is Arsuan. Tells us that she had heard talk about her, who was a genius of fire attribute. Indicates that he never thought that would be superior to her magic. She tells us she has good precision with its magic. To which the companion mentions that if she practices, she will be superior to her. Villian asks her to stop, indicating that she no longer wants to talk. Even though she feels a lot better this way, she decides to leave. And the other one, already alone, we see that he looks at her with eyes of despair. Moments later, in a place of the academy, we see a Bilon, all suddenly someone calls her, Fuaza Kodlan, Zola Kodlan, and when turning around, observes that it is the bodyguard Yaiterin, who gives her the welcome. She prepared some snacks for her, Hatokse, and informs that the remodeling that she asked for, it's already in progress. That's how she is telling her the report, to what Billini says she understands. But the bodyguard indicates that something does not fit. Mentions that she has heard that the canes can absorb continuously the mana of its bearer. This surprises Villian, who asks if it wasn't just a demonic tool. She tells her that apparently not, since constantly consumes the energy. Billion cannot believe it, and asks why. That cane was middle class, the bodyguard indicates that because that was only upper middle class. Princess asks, what does she mean by that? Which is indicated that according to the user, this could be upper class or superior. But since the staff absorbs mana, could be sustained. And that is why it was reduced class. This surprises Villian. Homavli. Who wonders if she will be able to use it? Partner mentions that she also does not know. But Villian, holding her head, mentions that no one will want to use that with that data. She decides to calm down and mention that this peasant will know how to solve it, since she was who asked it. Several days later, in an academy class, we see the protagonist attentively. The teacher mentions that Mana's ornithology class is mandatory as it will help them in the focus of the shot. And the target, as well, decides to draw some points, indicating that's the orbital formula, that's how it goes. Explaining its characteristics, and the students conclude that they will not be able to do it, because if they are not experts of the water, will not be able to learn. They wonder if they joke, and you made a gesture indicating that it is very boring. But he realizes that he was caught, so they ask him to stand up to resolve the question. To what this mentions that he will do it. Moments later, we see that he achieves solve it, which surprises the teacher, since note that he solved it easily. Asks if it's your first class, to what the protagonist says no. This is how the class ends, indicating that we'll continue to the next one. Da juhisi. All start to leave the place, but suddenly the protagonist hears someone calling him. Turns around and note that it was I, who he tells him that she wants to ask him something. This surprises the protagonist, who, observing her, questioned that she wants to know. In that us, he says he has been watching him during this time, and concluded that he was intelligent like the best, has a toe. Notice that the previous question was difficult, but he solved it without any problem, mentions that the question was of master level. And it was not easy at all, so when he saw him, he wondered who it is truly you soul. Tells us that at first she wasn't sure, but he concluded that he had a strategy, of course, registration. So if it is so, she has to know it, so ask for his next class, Reshid. To which the protagonist, confused, asks if she is interested, in which AZ tells him no. The protagonist does not understand, and asks, then to what does she mean? She tells him that investigated and concluded that it could get high grades in the classes, so questions again where he learned those strategies. Because she is very interested, he tells her that he doesn't know what she is talking about, so she decides to finish, indicating that if that is all, she will go away. That's trying to stop it, but notice that he is not paying attention to her. So, taking courage, she asks the protagonist to wait. He is surprised, and when he turns around, he asks about the why she follows him. He mentions that if she wants to learn those things, she should look for another smarter person, or can look for other classes that suit her. She tells him that any class that take you will not be able to stand out, but if she joins him, she could get a high grade. But he fears that if he does that, his life will be affected. Notes the protagonist understands, and observing her can't believe he's worried about her notes. The protagonist mentions that it is very annoying to him, but since she was the protagonist, she will leave it. Tells her that she can do whatever she wants, and she, with a good attitude, wants him to recommend her a good class to get good grades. This surprises the protagonist, who tells her she won't convince him with that appearance. She understands, indicating that normally she thought it would work, and she tells him that she was just joking, and tells him that will prepare compensation for his help. The protagonist does not understand, and thinks ask where she learned to be so weird. The girl asks about the ghost story, which surprises the protagonist. He says that he knows, and the girl can't believe it, because many people don't know it, looking around the place. Begins to tell some parts where the barriers prevent entry to the people, but Seer is suddenly stopped by the protagonist, who asks to wait. For this surprises the girl, who asks if it's okay. The protagonist says yes, but thinking comments that this information is very valuable. Tells us that with this information, the protagonist increases his favorability. With the male protagonist, tells that the fact that Flam the Flam know that is that he read the novel original. So he concludes that yesterday she had to tell that to the male protagonist. But now she is telling this to an extra like him, so decides not get involved. By indicating that story is interesting. These are going talking, and the girl tells him that the protagonist she will also tell it to him. Tapagot sinks and wonders why he wants to tell him that. Moments later he says, who understands, and tells him to take the class of meditation journey to the abyss. This is he thinks about it and asks how it would help her. That's why the protagonist looks for an excuse and tells him that his teacher opted for it and elevated enormously its magical power. This surprises the girl, who is left without words. In that tell us that this, still it does not come to light. But it says that the bishops who handle the magic of destruction meditation, Heroho is important for them, since they are their formulas and equations. But in the last instance, from the mind removes the mana of the heart. Yimecheken amends by indicating that he did not tell it to nobody, but makes an exception for her, since she is pretty. She doesn't believe is, but thinking about it makes her happy. Thanks, indicating that he will register in that class. Then, moments later, they say goodbye. The protagonist, upon observing her, wonders about why did he tell her that, since this could change the future of history, but remembers that if he does nothing, she will have a tragic death in this life. So, we see him happy because he managed to help her. But suddenly, he remembers something, indicating that he is also a magician. So, he will have to train too. Tells us that in the game, Yale Seol trained his body straight until a point. Hey Shav, woke up his physique and grew immensely. Mentions that in the game he could gain experience with just the push of a button. But now, you will have to do it physically like this. Indicates that he will be grateful to Asai.